Okay,
All right, we are recording.
let it rip.
Oh, hi everyone. Welcome to another session of American Public Policy Redux. This is a free-for-all tonight. I'm laughing because as Pat has instructed us, we are going to be talking about our unique individual experience in public policy making. And I'm getting a question here if we could define terms, et cetera, et cetera. If you could set the stage more or less for us, Pat, of what you would like for this evening and what our viewers are to expect on the YouTube channel.
All right. And I'll do some, but Anne, if there are others you want me to do it, and if some of you remember the policy class, there's gray area between some of these things. So I'll set out a basic definition, but don't beat me up because I know that they're not, things don't fit into black and white categories. There are shades of gray. So the one that I saw there from Anne was private interest groups and obviously public interest groups. The standard way that political scientists distinguish between those different types of groups concerns the benefits they seek to obtain. And private interest groups seek to obtain benefits that can be specified for a particular group. Public interest groups seek to obtain a good that cannot be divided, but generally accrues to everyone, or at the very least, you don't need to be a member of the group to get the benefit. And I'm sorry, I'm going to do the low-hanging fruit. The easy thing is environmentalist groups. They can't simply say that only dues-paying members of the Sierra Club get cleaner air and the rest of you choke on smog. Okay. Well, what are some other terms you want me to run through?
Well, I guess I'm still just trying. So, like, for example, you have an interest group, Child Care America, right? And they're all about advocating for high quality childcare for across the nation. Would you consider them private or public?
Oh God, are we going to do this?
I'd
say public.
Yeah,
I'm not going to weasel around. I'd say public. But I'm going to freely admit that there will be cases where it's a more or less difficult call. But if you have the basic distinction there, then that's probably enough to move the discussion along.
Well, I'm going to say this, and we can use whatever terminology, but I don't find in the federal sector that we use these terms anymore. These are not the terms that we use, right? And
yeah. No.
Yeah.
Yeah, but just because in the federal system they don't use the terms doesn't mean the terms don't have value. They just mean that in that context, we're in politically, there are reasons why we don't want to use the two, because the private interest group is more pejorative and the public interest group is more positive.
Right, but I'm not, yeah, and I wouldn't even, well, it's a whole other thing. So we would typically say NGOs, non-governmental organizations, right? And yeah, I'll leave it at that. I just want to understand what we're talking about because it sort of matters in terms of how we think about their impact on the policy process.
Well, why don't you since you have the floor, can you just talk to us maybe a minute or two about your experience in implementing policy as it is passed and the charge and the work that you do?
So I was looking at the text or whatever, the Facebook post, Pat, that you did earlier. And in some ways, I feel like that hasn't changed a lot. Like, I think there's still many elements. But what my experience is, there's a lot of working in the federal sector around in specific policy issues. I feel like there's a lot of organizations that are aligned fairly closely with certain federal agencies' missions and goals, and that actually those non-governmental organizations contribute quite a bit to accomplishing the goals and outcomes that are trying to be achieved by the federal agencies.
In what way?
Well, so for example, a group, just think of a current example. So one of the groups that we work with is called Smart Growth for America. And they're all about trying to essentially create more walkable communities, increase physical, for my group, right, we're trying to increase physical activity, make people more healthy. And that group, the work that they do at the state and local level can advance those objectives actually in many ways that we're not able to because we don't have the budget. So we are aligned in our goals. And so it's a very productive relationship in terms of we have goals that we're trying to achieve, which derive from, in this case, the Public Health Service Act, the intent of Congress in terms of our funding lines. And those agencies become critical for us to partner with to achieve our objectives.
So what I want you to do now is to spin out in what way that coordination occurs.
So it's a variety of ways. Sometimes it's advocacy at the local level to support policies at the local and state level that will actually achieve those outcomes that we're trying to achieve.
But not achieving them through you.
What do you mean by that?
Well, in other words, they're trying to get local governmental authorities to do things, and then you at the CDC can say, good job, guys, as opposed to working together through the federal agency to get something done.
So it's intermingled at the state and local level. So let's say we put out a grant, right, to support, in this case, more walkable communities to improve physical activity in the nation, right? And that's their goal as well. So we have those common objectives, and we might, for example, fund them at the federal level to provide technical assistance to the local level. How do you build a coalition, community coalition to support that activity? How do you provide the information and develop the information that's needed for local elected officials to understand what the choices are and to make decisions about, policy decisions around implementing, implementing that policy moving forward. So what I'm saying is, I feel like a lot of these interest groups or NGOs, whatever you call them, and we can agree on the terms, is they actually can be, not always, can be a natural extension to implementing certain objectives that the federal agencies have that, again, perhaps they don't have the resources to accomplish on their own. I don't know. That's just to kick it off.
No, that's good. And I think it's when we get down to the nuts and bolts that we can do a better job of seeing. And that was why I kept probing for exactly how that interaction occurred. And you're right. You've got a number of different ways it's occurring there, and it includes putting in place both desired, existing federal policy and then shaping local policy as well. And then some of it is one of the interesting things that came up among a number of you the last time was the notion that agencies would lobby interest groups, lobby groups. Well, that kind of looks a little bit like what's going on there. So it's when you got down to the details, that was really fruitful.
I was just thinking about this week, that one of the things that's changed since the early 90s when I took your class and now about how implementation works is you know, agencies have to put rulemaking in the Federal Register so that you can have, public can have an ability to comment.
Right.
What's different now about the comment period, and I deal mostly with the Department of Labor and the Securities and Exchange Commission, but is that the amount of commenting that happens now is tenfold what it used to be, mostly because of the ability to submit electronically, and because of organizations like Move On and you know, Public Citizen, who have vast memberships, who this is what they do, is they make it easy for their members to comment. So now, like, a rule that seems like nobody gives a crap about, for example, past 2 weeks, the Trump administration has been going on a banger of like getting rid of all of these policies that have been around since the beginning of the Securities and Exchange Commission that protect investors, in my mind, and in a lot of other people's mind. The comments on them have been, you know, thousands and thousands and thousands of comments about whether or not proxy voting services should be regulated by the federal government, for example. So that's one thing that's changed a lot, is that you have to be able to mobilize your membership to comment on those things. And then once all of those comments are, that's part of the public record. So if an organization is going to sue, or the federal government is going to sue, they have to use those comments as the basis for their litigation. So that's changed a lot too.
Yeah, that's, let me put that in the context of change there. I mean, initially, private interest groups that had that narrow interest and often had sort of a constituency that was better off, more politically connected, more resources, blah, 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 blah. Well, they could bring to bear a ton of resources and a ton of attention to the implementation process. And typically, public interest groups had a greater difficulty growing their membership. So they didn't have the same kinds of resources. But over time, those public interest groups have become increasingly sophisticated in how to grow their membership and activate their membership, the kind of things that Jen's talking about, and increasingly sophisticated that they're actually looking at the implementation process. And I think a certain amount of that came out of environmental politics, where it looked like you had these huge victories when it came to various Clean Air Acts and so on. And then, well, they weren't getting implemented the way that they wanted, but they only learned those kinds of things long after the fact. So there was a learning curve going on there too, so that now, I mean, this is a really cool thing that goes way beyond the kinds of things that I would talk about in the 1970s that were occurring with public interest groups and accelerated in the 80s. Well, it continued to like take off, changing the way that public interest groups can participate in the implementation process. That's cool.
Maureen, I know she's here. And if you could provide some background too, Maureen, on what you're currently doing that leads you to these observations.
So currently I am pretending to be a Stepford wife, but my next job starts on the 23rd of November, where I'll be a telecommunications senior policy specialist at the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. There's so many words there, but it's not the lengthiest title. So drawing back to my experience in more of the foreign policy world, where I think there are, you know, like you're saying, like the interest groups, private, public, can merge and intermingle on things such as human rights vetting for security assistance overseas, for the State Department, Defense Department, any US agency who wants to help another country's military or police do something. that was never going to be an easy pill for the Pentagon to swallow. But it started with, 40 some years ago, how small protest movements and then interest groups and whatnot, lobbying groups, were able to gather the sense that US tax dollars shouldn't pay for people in other countries to do immoral or crimes against humanity. And now it's a really rigid process. In fact, it's almost too difficult for a country's police force or security force to get off of a human rights vetting blacklist. So it's just a fascinating, see that over time how it changed from a good idea, and if you can do the vetting, you should, to if you want money from Congress, thou shall do the vetting and you shall show the reports. But then you'll still always have that feedback from trusted advisors. People on the Hill typically go to their preferred think tanks for such evaluations on things like that too. So that kind of goes back and forth. And then my last world was the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. And that's so intermingled that, administration policy of we need to protect our intellectual property, our trade secrets. It's a part of national security, but it also can be a tool for some companies to prevent things they don't want to happen. There's a show called Silicon Valley on HBO, and their last season, it's all about this, like a bunch of shenanigans, a startup tech company, yada, yada, yada. They become kind of a big thing and they don't want to be sold, so they invoke CFIUS. I saw this kind of happen, and it's a story that made it in the newspaper about a silicon wafer company back in the day. Basically, one day a hostile takeover happened, and therefore their company would be owned by a foreign entity. So they invoked CFIUS to prevent that from happening. So that was also like an interesting back and forth of business elites trying to utilize a policy office to get what they want, but also the greater good, depending on your view of free market capitalism, is that that it would protect trade secrets important to U.S. national security. So yeah, those it's all kind of all over the place in the foreign policy, national security world. I wouldn't say that we're as opposed to what Anne was saying about using groups that maybe have more resources than a federal office may have. If in the Department of Defense you don't have resources, you're not looking in the right couch cushions. So it's more like depends on the administration's thoughts on who should lead foreign policy. Traditionally, the State Department should be in the lead doing diplomacy, but the Defense Department always had that financial machine to churn through programs faster and contracts and things like that and get things overseas just because it's just so big. So it started to take the lead more. And you can see the difference between, say, the George Bush administration and the Obama administration and how that played out. There was a better give and take in theory in the Obama administration. So DOD has the machine and the tools, but state is still in the lead, and we're talking. I think a good example of that is the counterterrorism fellowship program. That was a Bob Gates, Hillary Clinton shared interest, where on the, but however, those 4-star generals were not super thrilled about having to get permission from the State Department. So there's always that issue there too. So it can cycle through, some of these outside US interests cycle through. Human trafficking is a big one. It's not because DOD has a human trafficking problem. Things like human rights vetting, like I said before, this issue with the roundup and the spraying of the narcotics or the coca plants in Latin America. Yeah. Again, another local constituency issue that grew in over time. I remember sitting in a meeting where our Assistant Secretary at State International Narcotics and Law Enforcement said, "It's just the same chemical you use on your sidewalks. I don't want to hear about any more bunnies losing their fur." It wasn't a great look for her, but again, like that was 2006, and now it's it's a court case that was found in favor of the victims, and that will have an effect, as we all know, in policies. So that's all over the place, but yeah, the stakeholders are interesting cats to herd in the foreign policy world, but I think it similarly plays out as was taught, but.
Oh, actually, I mean, this is great because the model didn't claim to say anything at all about foreign policy. It was all about domestic policy. I mean, I vaguely remember that I then did like a separate thing on foreign policy, which honestly, where there was far less theoretical development in the discipline. And in part because you get such a wide range of kinds of issues that fit into foreign policy. So, international trade policy ain't going to look like deterrence policy.
Like
things
steel tariffs, for example, that's an interesting hybrid of public and foreign policy. So what's the international stick to that? Well, the World Trade Organization. Does everyone have 5 to 6 years for that organization to figure out whether or not they can agree on sanctioning the United States about Section 232 steel tariffs? Meanwhile, public interest groups or NGOs and other international organizations can lobby here in the United States. They can go direct to Congress and try to change those types of things from there. I think in my experience over time, I've seen like how policies implemented in, say, in the state of California or New York have a lot of effect on our bilateral relationships with certain countries overseas. So like that foreign policy, public policy is grayer, or isn't as easy to decipher as one or the other in some cases.
Oh yeah.
And yeah, that was great, Maureen. Thank you. And I had a little bit of an aha moment. I'm trying to figure out, I have sort of like two ideas here, but I feel like with policy implementation, there are a number of issues that are, and I almost wanted to use the word that are like, put them in the category of political polarization. In other words, they're high profile at the highest levels of government, and there's a lot of attention, and it gets a lot of play, right? At the highest levels of the cabinet level departments or Congress. And that's one set of issues. And then there's like another set of issues, and I've kind of worked in both, that are really under the radar, right? And I'm thinking about, Pat, your policy model about political polarization and then things that can be negotiated. And like I would say, there's a whole set of agencies, and I'm sort of in one right now, kind of sort of, that are not getting into COVID and all that, which is obviously part of CDC, but that are a little bit under the radar, and they get negotiated a little bit more in the back and forth way, that might be a little bit of the more old policy model. But I do think it's worth making the distinction. And then and Pat, I was thinking about what you said, I don't know if it was last week or the week before, about how a lot of these policy models didn't take into account the state and local, from some of the political scientists.
Yeah, because structurally we're going to look differently.
But it's
they could.
Right. But it's so critical in achieving the aims of policy implementation and the goals of the agencies and what. So it's a little, anyway, just something to explore for future.
Yeah, and the stuff on implementation, I mean, the book that I had you guys read, Implementation, dealt with that in a limited way, because that was the kind of implementation, excuse me, that was kind of implementation that became all the rage in the 1960s with the Great Society. And that was, the federal government is involved and we're going to bypass the state governments because that's where all those bigots are. And we're going to go straight to local governments. So you had a less complicated, in a sense, because you weren't using all three levels of the federal structure. But that, I mean, the reason I used it was that became this really popular model during that period of time. And that book is easily the best, most intelligent book ever written on implementation, even though it's as old as.
But what we find in our work with our community programs, we can't get the work done without community support, community coalitions, participation and buy-in at the community level. The work will not get done. We will not achieve our objectives.
Yeah.
It's
So, and that's because
these are programs that are fundamentally, if you don't, okay, it's about people and it's about organizational cultures and getting elected officials at the local level to put in place policies that are going to, in our case, improve the health of the community. If you don't have buy-in, it's not going to work. They will fight you and you will not accomplish anything. It doesn't work.
Okay. It's not
the level that happens too within federal agencies. You don't have the buy-in of even like the worker bee too. Like some things just never happen, let alone it being implemented out into a national sense.
It's organizations, right? So I know my MPA program, right? It's organizational culture. You have to, if you can't get acceptance at the organizational level, you can't make some of these fundamental changes.
But I think for a very long period of time, there wasn't recognition of that reality on the part of folks at the federal government.
Agreed.
And I mean, it's probably developed for a whole host of different reasons. But I don't think that you heard, I mean, that's what y'all are talking about, that's a far more sophisticated way of seeing the process than historically federal agencies often thought of it.
Well, but I'm not sure. What I don't know is, Pat, was it that the political science didn't capture it? Because federal agencies for many years have been giving out grants to communities to accomplish all kinds of things, right?
But they didn't worry about building support on the local level.
I'm not
What
sure.
they did was just sort of send it on down and say, this is what you've got to do. So it wasn't political scientists, it was bureaucrats who thought that they could simply send the guidelines down and good stuff would happen. And you saw that with that case study that I gave you.
Yeah, it probably varies. Yeah, I don't know. I think it's evolved. I think it's evolved. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm guessing that it might have evolved because once they started measuring outcomes through evaluation or performance audits and they weren't achieving outcomes, I'm guessing that one of the things that they've discovered is, in order to figure out what works, is that they decided that community input was required to understand the populations they're trying to reach or the context of special situations there. And it's just my guess in the evolution of how important evaluation has become and outcomes and accountability, but that's just a guess.
There's also the issue too of the fact that there's so much more contracted now, right? So like that's the other thing. Like it used to be that, you know, state government agencies would carry out the federal government's policies, and now that's not the case. Now it's private organizations have contracts that are having to do it, and they have to apply and go for it. And if they don't want it or they don't agree with things, I mean, there's all sorts of stuff there too that's impacting the way that things are implemented.
Yeah, it's a great discussion. Take smoking policy, right? So look at, okay, so the Surgeon General's report on smoking and health, I think came out mid-70s, something like that, right? And
Yeah, even
slowly
earlier.
what the federal, and there's an Office of Smoking Health and CDC, and there's other folks who have an interest, but until you could get community buy-in to restrict, so it started with, many of you may not remember because you're so young, but you know, it used to be, remember Pat, the smoking sections in a restaurant, that was a huge deal where you had a smoking and non-smoking section within a restaurant, right? And then more of the health effect information.
They did it on They did it on airplanes too.
Yeah, one time I got a first class seat because I couldn't get a seat because there wasn't a seat in the non-smoking section. Anyway.
Yeah.
So, but what I'm saying is you couldn't have implemented a lot of the smoking interventions, the interventions to stop, you know, to reduce smoking in this country had to do with community buy-in and support at the local level. And you couldn't have done it. Sorry, I'm at my mom's house. She just turned off the lights. Mom, can you turn the lights back on? I look like a ghost. Thank you, Mom. Sorry, I'm at my mom's house. Anyway, but I'm just, anyway, there's a whole richness about what happens, you know, at that federal, state, local. And Leslie, I love your comments about, you know, again, measuring outcomes and effectiveness, which is not really what's talked about at the federal policy level to a certain extent.
Yeah, there were just recently laws, or at least like paragraphs added to like the foreign affairs budget for state and for DoD about evaluation, metrics and evaluation. Maybe we should figure out if our billions of dollars spent on these programs overseas are working. And it's still, and it was like 2016 when that happened. And I was working business development this last year. State was just in 2020 getting the request for proposal out for contractors to bid on if they could do metrics and evaluation for programs overseas. So not even state, like federal employees are doing it. State Department, federal employees are doing it, but it's like.
Yeah, agreed. But we've been talking about that forever, right? So when I first entered federal service in '88, and you had Al Gore, the Hammer Awards, the TQM, Total Quality Improvement, you had Reinventing Government. I mean, we've been talking about this for 30 years. Yeah. And and we keep re-talking about it. We're not at the sweet spot yet.
Yeah, there's no lessons learned yet. USA
some agencies have taken it and done things with it, and others haven't.
Yeah, I like to say like AID has some of the stronger programs implementing metrics and evaluation, but you're right, Anne. It's something that you talk about, and you get smart people and charismatic people in front of cameras say, "Oh, we really should figure this out," and then I think people don't understand it at the working level, and it just gets recycled again.
And Congress, they sort of like kind of say they care, but I'm not convinced.
I'll give you there's I have friends who do a fair amount of research in this area, and it's a very, very old scholarly article, but it posited the existence of two different kinds of congressional oversight. And one, which is what they generally found, they called fire alarm oversight. You know, that the legislators aren't really paying attention unless the building is burning down, and then they focus on it, and then it's a really critical, negative kind of oversight. But in terms of having routine oversight, that was far less frequently observed when they looked at different congressional committees that could engage in oversight. And that's part of why when you look at that like overview that I did on implementation, you kind of left Congress out, right? Because that's the extraordinary event. It's not the norm, it's not the ordinary thing. it's what happens when the building's burning down. And then they jump in.
So I agree, but without that accountability, and I think back to some case studies that I read in graduate school about, it's just so striking to me in the coal mines, right? And it was the whole discussion about what happens with regulation of the coal mines. And it's just a cycle, right? So, you have this regulation, essentially the company ignores the safety protocols, the regulators don't do their job in terms of oversight. They file their reports with problems. Everyone ignores it. This goes on until there's, the mine collapses, right? And people die. And then everyone holds up their hands like, oh my God, what happened? It's like, are you freaking kidding? Like there are all these, but it's just, it's so frustrating because so without accountability, without leadership, without oversight, it doesn't, these problems will cycle.
Yeah, and I think that's a great example because you have this incredible disparity in power and influence and ability to influence the bureaucrats in that agency, let alone what they find, but it's what do they do with it? Well, those mining companies, they could get away with murder, and they were in close consultation with the agency, and miners' unions lacked, in some cases, even the knowledge that they needed to follow up on the process, and certainly the resources to effectively put pressure on them. So the mining companies could just go through that cycle, right, of violating regulations and guidelines. Lots of folks die, they get bad press, and then you start all over again.
Right, and so you have to conclude there's a power differential.
Yeah, it's then, I mean, now we're getting kind of the normative side. So how do you change things so that you get more meaningful oversight or regulation, depending upon, where you want to hit the problem, right? You can hit the problem saying, we need to change something about the way in which the bureaucratic agency operates internally, or you do something to change about something about the way that Congress polices them, oversees them.
And right now, because Congress doesn't do anything, they're non-players, even more so than in the past. They're non-entities, so things are just
25 mandated reports that are due 90 days after signature, and maybe somebody's legislative aide reads it, maybe not. Okay. But you do get dinged.
Yeah, I was going to add to this is that this doesn't really cover a large percentage of government programs, but I'm in performance auditing, which is similar to the GAO at the state level, government oversight and accountability. And I will say that, the majority of our recommendations coming out of those reports are to the agencies about how to improve their operations in order to get better outcomes. And some of the recommendations go to decision makers, elected officials, to change laws that may be adversely impacting implementation, that at the time that they wrote it, they didn't realize it would cause this weird unintended consequence in implementation. But we have no power to make them implement these recommendations. And we have a pretty good track record. And granted, there's a lot of public pressure when a report comes out. It's on the cover of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution usually. But we have about 80% implementation rate of our recommendations in agencies, which is a good thing. And then we do have laws change to help the agencies become more effective. But again, the resources put around our kind of work is minimal compared to the spending and number of programs that are out there. But it is a check on implementation, and
I know that we can be very cynical about government, but I really do feel like in the agencies we go to, you have a lot of people that are do-gooders that are there for the right reasons, and they might be expert social workers or they might be experts in public health, but they're not really necessarily great managers or knowing how to actually execute, you know, in a pragmatic way, how to deliver the service. And so we do get a lot of compliments, actually, like, hey, you learned how to do this and this makes a lot of sense, and people really excited about trying to implement that. Now, I would say the tone has changed, and I've been doing this for about 26 years. Now it's getting a little bit more political, like where people are doubling down on arguing facts that they don't really have and we have. But for the most part, I would say that that is, I mean, maybe a gem in this whole implementation process, because it really is a mess. I mean, people start out with good intentions when the lawyers write these laws, and they're either too vague and people don't know how to implement them, and so they do them in kind of weird and inefficient ways, or they write things in that get misinterpreted. There's so many different things that happen with implementation. It's really very fascinating, but so anyway, the GAO kind of entity does do that at the behest of Congress. But again, I don't know that it's, you know, how much people are reading those reports and holding them to account. I mean, we've seen that too, as those agencies that we audit go to a budget hearing, and they used to punish them for bad results, and sometimes they actually needed more money to do the job better, but sometimes they were afraid of being punished through the budget process, and so they say, okay, we're going to do all these things to fix this problem. So anyway, just another part of this whole thing that complicates it.
Yeah. No, I think that you know, GAO, inspectors general, perform this incredibly valuable service, and they do really, really, really good work. Solid, valuable research, and so it's sad when that doesn't find receptive ears, and you know, either in the agency or in the legislature. I think you're. I'll state up. I'll throw out a hypothesis. I'm going to guess that it's even harder on the state level than the national level, just because of the difference in resources that are available. Or if there's the difference in willingness to, or ability, that one, it may be more willingness, and the other one, it may be more ability to respond.
Yeah, so I spent 15 years in the Inspector General's office at the federal level.
Right.
So I completely understand what Leslie's saying and agree. I'm not sure, Pat, it's a great thought. It's pretty hard it waxes and wanes at the federal level. I'm not sure it's easier. It's a little harder because you're not as connected with the
I was going to say my
on the ground program. So I think Leslie has more the ability to have that back and forth.
I think the problem with the states is they have less financial resources, but they have less bureaucracy required to fix things. So it's kind of both, to your point. So people can make changes without having to cycle through as much bureaucracy, unless of course they're a partially federally funded agency. Then we have that problem all the time, is some of the things that are broken are the federal directives, and we can only share that information with the federal sponsoring agency. But anyway, but I think for the most part, if it's kind of a state program, they may not have the money needed to do some of the initial fixes, and money is really tight at the state level and the local level. But they aren't weighted down by the bureaucracy or size of the government.
But at the federal level, OIG, GAO, and you can read those reports, you're never allowed to quantify or recommend that more money is spent.
Nope, it's
to fix a
taboo.
And it's completely taboo. So if you don't have a congressional committee or an agency that grabs onto your recommendation and decides it's a good idea, you're kind of dead in the water. Because you're not allowed to actually, and when I came to the agency from the IG, I realized, well, first of all, I kind of I always knew the importance of those groups still stands, but it doesn't actually recognize the challenges within the bureaucracy to make those to really make those changes.
Yeah, and so we do try to find other ways for them to get resources or leverage other resources so that they don't have to ask for money. But, you know, honestly, I think we have this recommendation in every single report we have is their data management is so poor. They need better systems for tracking and measuring. And so without saying you need to give them more money, they really need some better systems to understand their outcomes and what's happening, especially in something that's a very decentralized implementation. It's really hard to know what people are doing in the field and whether what they're doing in one place is the same as the other and whether you're collectively reaching a similar outcome. And so a lot of times they're lacking. And you don't always have to do something really complicated, but you'd be surprised how antiquated their data collection and systems are for managing. So again, you're right. It's taboo to say give them more money, but there are things like where you point out a problem or need that sometimes the only way is to invest some more money. And the other ways, you know, we did like a, wildlife resources gaming audit, and they had no money. And this was not an important program, but we discovered that because there were I think they were giving away licenses free to senior citizens, but the way to leverage more federal funds was for every $1 that you collected, you like got 10 from the federal government. We said, if you just charge them $1 for their license, then you can now get funding this other way. And so we've tried to find creative ways when money really is a problem.
That's cool.
And it happened. They did. They charged them a nominal fee, and they leveraged more federal funds to improve some of their parks, state parks. So anyway, yeah, money, you never really come right out and say they need more money.
Yeah.
No.
Are we good?
Yeah, we're good on 9. It's 9:30. So is anybody?
It is getting along. Let me kind of, I'm going to confess, implementation really ain't my jam. It's not the thing that it's what you guys do really, really well. And you spent years and years doing it. And like I said, I was approaching this in terms of theoretical models so that you can have a sort of a larger understanding of what's going on. And it's not as though political scientists have done squat on implementation anyway. I don't know how much more to do there, but Michelle and I talked about where we go, if we go, where we go, or if we keep going on doing these Zoom sessions. I mean, I'm retired, man. I got plenty of time. I can do this. It's not hard. And so if there's interest out there, then we can keep doing stuff. Do you have any immediate ideas?
Well, I know we talked about women in politics and your study and your research on that. That's definitely one that I know Jen and I have expressed interest in. I mean, my question too would be, how did you end the public policy course? Certainly you're just not like, implementation's not my jam. Sorry, ladies, good job and see you next semester. So how did you end the public policy course, and
in ways we sort of went over a number of things that y'all mentioned. And yeah, come on, it was like a 200 level course.
Yeah, it wasn't.
It had nice, neat little bows on the top, and I could tie them at the end and give it to you. And
yeah, we had to write that final paper on the Veterans Administration, and you made us read that book about how it became a cabinet agency. And
well, that was earlier. That was earlier in the semester. That was the policymaking.
yeah.
Yeah, Pat, in your defense, so I have an MPA, a number of people here. We dug into that a lot more in terms of the implementation. MPA,
Yeah.
policy implementation.
You dug into it. Into what?
Into policy implementation.
For sure.
Oh yeah.
Right.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I mean, my MPA was almost solidly focused on implementation, particularly because being at NYU, it was a large feeder for the New York City. I didn't know that when I went into it, but as I got in there, I realized that NYU, being a great program, was also a feeder into New York City, New York State, governmental positions, or those third-party actors we've mentioned that serve New York City or New York State in some capacity. And there's an international focus there as well. But that was all the entire discussion here tonight. I felt like I spent, 5 years, it was the 2-year program, I did part-time, but 5 years of really talking about implementation. I mean, I could dig out my MPA notes and Paul Light courses that I took and see that, what they said there. Oh, he was. Yeah.
We were lucky.
So, I mean, we could go that realm.
Yeah. We were lucky at Syracuse. The Maxwell School is the nation's #1 MPA program, but I was in ranked 8 IR program, international relations program. But because of the public administration program, my IR program focused on foreign policy implementation as well. So it was, who are your stakeholders? Do you have budgets? Do you have legal authorities? How do you work, in the sense of development? Who are your people you're working with on the ground, getting buy-in and things like that. So I think maybe, how, policymaking in an era transition to an extent, like Trump to Biden, Biden beyond, maybe presidential transition is always a fascinating world. And figuring out first moves.
Yeah, there's a qualitative difference between the kind of level of analysis that I had you guys engage in the policy class and what you're doing in an MPA program, which is essentially a professional program. So there's a lot more really concrete nuts and bolts kinds of things. It's my understanding is that you don't really very often get to higher level theory so that you're developing a model of the process. And I, I don't even know that any of you really care about doing that with implementation. You're dealing with implementation through the MPA program was a much more pragmatic. It wasn't an intellectual kind of exercise. It's not supposed to be.
Well, I think that it's if I may, it depended on your program. And that was really my crux.
Sure.
We're trying to decide between Indiana and Syracuse and NYU, was that one, NYU and also Syracuse were more touting on the implementation. It's, it's the MBA for nonprofit and city government officials, whereas Indiana, being the top of the top of the top, was focused on a lot more theory. And I was good with theory.
Yeah, but even there, not a lot.
Okay.
Not a lot. We've had a bunch of students do their MPAs at IU.
Yeah,
a bunch.
It's hard. Yeah, it's hard to get in. It speaks to St. Mary's for sure.
Yeah.
No, it's definitely. I think there's so many personalities driving implementation too. So I don't know how in the weeds one gets in theory, because it seems to change every time somebody gets rid of an agency or creates a new one, and who has regulation and authority over it. So that whole part can be challenging.
Yeah, and that's I think when you're so deeply involved in the process, it's really difficult to step back and then come up with a more parsimonious explanation for what's going on. In part because no matter what your general explanation looks like, there will be exceptions. Yep. There'll be those weird ass things that happen that you go, well, wait a second, that wasn't predicted by the model. Well, yeah, sure, because nothing's perfect. But I think if you're in the system and you're having to navigate it, you're probably going to rely primarily on that. I can navigate the system. Once you put me down here in this spot, I can figure stuff out and I can navigate it and figure out how to work the system. But then again, it becomes harder to like step back and see that more like parsimonious model that in an important sense simplifies your understanding of what's going on. I mean, that was sort of the mantra of my classes, right? Was that intelligence involved taking a look at stuff that looks complicated to everybody else and saying, no, it's really simple. Here's how you understand it. But again, I don't know that folks even want to do that. That's a real academic kind of thing.
I think that's true, but I think there are some fundamentals, like my experience working in different parts of the bureaucracy. And there's a huge value in understanding kind of the partners, the actors at play, the bigger picture of how Congress works and what the interests are and how the policy make. I found that to be valuable.
Oh yeah. No, I wasn't saying it doesn't happen. I'm what I would say is folks like you guys who
just want to get our crap done.
I'm sorry?
We just want to get our stuff done. We want to implement our programs.
Yeah.
We want to have.
Yeah. But if you can develop those larger understandings of what's going on, you'll be more effective. You'll be more effective than the person who's just treading water.
Yes, maybe. It can help you. It's necessary, but not sufficient. Because sometimes
it's a different issue, Anne. I didn't say it was perfect. I said you'd be better. And I'm going to bet the farm, absolutely, you would be better. In fact, you are better. Because there are folks out there who don't see those things. And then when anything changes, they're screwed. If you understand why things work the way they do and you see changes occurring, you can start developing explanations and predictions for what the world is going to look like now. If they're just treading water and the water shifts, they drown.
That was my life 2017 and 2019. So yeah, I saw it happen.
Hopefully not the drowning part, yeah.
Not me drowning, other folks who didn't quite want to like understand 2 or 3 steps ahead, but were just really happy doing their one thing. So
Yeah.
Adrienne, did you have something you want to pipe in?
I did. I just wanted to kind of throw this out here as a possible topic, right?
Okay.
My experience and looking at stepping back a little bit, I spend a lot of time working with state and local governments around projects that would only be made possible by federal funding programs and the agencies that fund them. So there may be some value in spending some time talking about those players, right? And how that works. There may be some value in looking that a little bit. And there's a part of me that has a hypothesis that says with public policy becoming more and more partisan, as well as more and more of a drive of both parties towards a more state-driven perspective, less centralized policy making process, that we see that now executed policy after policy, legislation after legislation to agencies to say, go with the states and figure it out and come back to us and let us know how it goes, right? So I think there's something we could explore there that might bear some fruit. Just a thought.
I think that's a great idea, but I'm going to share with you, maybe this is the place to close, and then we'll get, and then folks can generate more ideas and post them, email them, whatever. When I first came to St. Mary's College in 1981, fresh out of graduate school, you're getting the Reagan administration, right? And I think I'm a really witty graduate student with a great sense of humor. And so I lived through Richard Nixon, who wanted to put into place lots more block grants. Federal government play far less role in determining the nature, the substance of public policy, issue broad grants to states and local governments, and then they use their discretion to pursue the broad general aims that you have in the legislation. Well, Ronald Reagan, and then that went away. And then Ronald Reagan comes in and he's going at it like with a vengeance. So my witty idea was to teach a course for little first year bunnies at St. Mary's College, the political issues class. Some of you I had in a political issues class, this little freshman class.
I think it might have been me.
You were. Here's what makes it particularly embarrassing for me. That course was designed to actually attract students into the political science major. I thought a really sexy topic would be Reagan, the new federalism. Do you want to know the quickest way to bore an undergraduate? The word federalism. Oh man, I died. I just died. I did it one semester, I learned my lesson, and I moved away. So it's only geeks like you guys who go, yeah, federalism, this is really cool shit.
That's what I told the Courier when they interviewed me about this class. I was like, it's a community. And I was like, no, it's just a bunch of geeks. Like, it's like, that's off the record. I was like, but it's a bunch of political nerds that only, you know, these type of women we would really enjoy it, get together. And there's none of us like us in the entire country. It's just all of St. Mary's, you know. I kind of went on. I was like, but that's all off the record, of course. But that's the only way I can find a way to describe us.
For fun at home, you know?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
With no end time to the call at all.
No, that's what I told her. I was like, we're trying.
It's supposed to end. We just keep on talking.
Exactly.
Well, those are all great ideas, and you may have more. Let's let this percolate for a little while. So maybe we don't even, maybe next week, all we do is talk about the ideas and then make decisions on where y'all want to go. Does that sound okay?
That's a good idea.
Okay.
Perfect.
Yeah, because we wouldn't meet the following Thursday, obviously. So
We're exactly
right
for Thanksgiving.
Well, a big thank you to Michelle and Pat so far for
Thank you.
humoring us all and leading
no,
us all.
thank
'Cause
you.
This has been a lot of fun so far. So, yeah, that sounds good.
Awesome.
Well, I can't speak for Michelle, but it's been a boatload of fun for me. And who was it? I think I've told a couple of folks that this is great because I get to. You're all kind of like my children who have gone out and grown up and done really awesome shit. And so I get to like, I'm doing this bit, but then when you guys jump in, I'm going, oh, that was really smart.
So you can take some credit.
Of course.
Oh, yeah. A little bit.
All right.
Yeah, you know, I'm gonna close it off there. So let's plan on doing that then.
Yeah.
Okay. So keep thinking about those ideas. If you want to, you know, zip me an email, if you want to like talk through one of them or you know, email through one of them, go ahead and do that. And then next time we'll just play around with the
And
idea.
it's really open, right? You're saying at this
Yeah.
point, like we've talked about public policy, you know, at this point, it's really open to our political nerd imaginations. So.
Yeah,
Awesome.
and you know, I'm certainly willing to actually sort of renew my scholarship on the women in politics stuff. There's voting behavior stuff.
Sure. Oh, that's good. That's top of my list,
That'd be
especially after this
fun.
last election.
That would be fun to go through for this election. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
And inherent biases in reading that data. Sorry, just throw that out there. I'm so tired of reading things. I'm like, you have a lens, like take your glasses off and look at, anyway. Okay.
yeah.
All right.
I will share with you the ongoing thing that, well, no, it's not ongoing because I can't visit him. But my best friend who is down in Kentucky, he's like a creative writer. He ended up in both teaching, but also doing kind of student affairs stuff at a community college down in Kentucky. And he's an addict for all of that god awful cable TV shit. And you know, I humor him when I'm there, but stuff will come on and I will just rip it up as being really stupid. And he's pointed out, he goes, you know, I usually watch this stuff and I'm going, oh, that's really a good question. Oh, that's really a good question. And then you come down here and ruin it for me by pointing out that it's all really stupid. Yeah.
Don't talk trash about Kornacki. If you start doing that, we're gonna have problems. Watch out.
And I think too, like I wouldn't hesitate to say, like, if there's a topic that like we could go find a speaker. Like I'm thinking, my mind's going down. I think we could easily in our networks of some sort find, like, Pat doesn't have to be the sole source of information here. If there's a topic or something that you really want to delve into, I think, you know, you're humble enough, Pat, to say, whoa, that's not my area of expertise. Let's find someone else. So like having, you know, Mary tonight was awesome, you know, to talk to us. And
well, the whole thing tonight was you guys.
Absolutely.
Wasn't me. No, and yeah. I mean, I think that's, that's a great idea.
Awesome. All right. Thanks, ladies. Have a good night.
Good night.
Bye.
Good night.